Suicide. 2 days had passed since she boarded the plane. At 6 in the morning, the telephone rang. It was Laura. She announced to her sister and brother-in-law that on Martinique it was exactly midnight. Her voice was unnaturally cheerful, which made Agnes conclude at once that things were turning out badly. She was not mistaken when Bernard saw Laura walking down the palm-lined avenue leading to the villa in which he lived. He went white with anger and said to her severely, "I asked you not to come here." She began to say something in explanation, but without another word, he threw a few of his things into a suitcase, got into the car, and drove off. She remained alone and wandered around the house. In one of the closets, she discovered her red swimsuit, which she had left there during a previous stay. "No one was waiting for me, only this swimsuit," she said, and passed from laughter to tears. Sobbing, she continued, "It was disgusting what he did. I threw up, and then I decided to stay. Everything will come to an end in this villa. When Bernard comes back, he will find me here in this swimsuit." Laura's voice echoed through the room. Both of them heard it, but they had only one receiver and passed it back and forth. "For heaven's sake," said Agnes, "calm down, just calm down. Try to be cool and sensible." Now Laura was laughing once again. "Just imagine, before the trip I got hold of 20 tubes of barbiturates, and I left them all in Paris. That's how nervous I was." "Oh, that's good, said Agnes, and indeed she felt somewhat relieved. "But I found a gun in one of the drawers," Laura continued. And again she laughed. "Bernard is obviously afraid for his life. He is afraid he'll be waylaid by some blacks. I see it as a sign." "What sort of sign?" "That he left the gun for me." "You're crazy. He did no such thing. He didn't even know that you were coming. Of course he didn't leave it intentionally, but he bought a gun that no one but me would ever use. Therefore he left it for me." Agnes again felt a sense of desperate powerlessness. She said, "Please, put the gun back where it was. I don't know how to handle it, but Paul, you hear me, Paul?" Paul took the receiver. "Yes." "Paul, I'm so glad to hear your voice." "So am I, Laura, but I beg you." "I know, Paul, but I can't go on anymore." And she began to sob. There was a moment of silence. Then Laura said, "That gun is lying in front of me. I can't take my eyes off it, so put it back where it was," said Paul. "Paul, you were in the army, weren't you?" "Yes." "You were an officer, a lieutenant. That means you know how to shoot a gun?" Paul hesitated, but he had to say yes. "How does one know that the gun is loaded?" "If it goes off, it's loaded." "If I press the trigger, will it go off?" "It might." "What do you mean it might?" "If the safety catch is off, the gun will fire." "And how do you know the catch is off?" "Come on now, you're not going to explain to her how to kill herself," shouted Agnes. And she tore the receiver from Paul's hand. Laura continued, "I only want to know how to handle it. After all, that's something I should know. How one handles a gun. What does it mean when the catch is off? How do you turn it off?" "That's enough," said Agnes. "Not another word about guns. Put it back where it was. We've had enough of this joking." Laura's voice suddenly became quite different, serious. "Agnes, I am not joking." And once again she started to cry. The conversation was endless. Agnes and Paul kept repeating the same sentences. They assured Laura of their love. They begged her to stay with them, not to leave them, until she finally promised to return the gun to the drawer and go to sleep. When they put down the receiver, they were so exhausted that for quite some time they were unable to say a single word. Agnes said at last, "Why is she doing this? Why is she doing this?" And Paul said, "It's my fault. I sent her there." "She would have gone in any case." Paul shook his head. "No, she was ready to stay. I did the stupidest thing of my life." Agnes did not want Paul to suffer from a sense of guilt, not out of compassion for him, but rather out of jealousy. She didn't want him to feel so responsible for Laura, to be so tied to her in his thoughts. That's why she said, "How can you be so sure that she actually found a gun?" At first, Paul had no idea what she meant. "What are you trying to say?" "That there may not be any gun there at all." "Agnes, she is not putting on an act. That's obvious." Agnes tried to formulate her suspicion more carefully. "It's possible there is a gun in the house, but it is also possible that she took some barbiturates along and deliberately brought up the gun in order to confuse us. And you cannot also rule out the possibility that she has neither barbiturates nor a gun and only wants to torment us." "Agnes," said Paul, "you're being cruel to her." Paul's reproach again put her on her guard. Without his realizing it, Laura had lately become more important to him than she was. He had been thinking about her, occupying himself with her, worrying about her. He had been moved by her, and Agnes was suddenly forced to think that Paul was comparing her to Laura and that she was emerging from the comparison as the one with less feeling. She defended herself. I am not cruel. I only want to warn you that Laura will do anything to attract attention. That's natural because she is suffering. Everyone has a tendency to laugh at her unfortunate love affair and to shrug their shoulders. Once she has a gun in her hand, no one can laugh anymore. And supposing her longing for attention leads her to take her own life, isn't that possible? It is possible, Agnes admitted. And once again there followed a long, anxious silence. Then Agnes said, I can imagine a person longing to take his life, not being able to bear pain any longer, and the meanness of people wanting to get out of their sight and vanish. Everyone has the right to kill himself. That's his freedom. I have nothing against suicide as a way of vanishing. She felt like stopping, but violent disapproval of her sister's behavior made her go on. But that's not the case with her. She doesn't want to vanish. She is thinking of suicide because she sees it as a way to stay with him, to stay with us, to engrave herself forever on all our memories, to force her body into our lives, to crush us. You're being unjust, said Paul. She's suffering. I know, said Agnes. And she broke into tears. She imagined her sister dead, and everything she had just said seemed petty and base and unforgivable. And what if she merely wanted to lull us with her promises, she said, and began to dial the number of the villa on Martinique. The phone kept ringing and ringing, and their foreheads began to sweat again. They knew that they would never be able to hang up and would listen endlessly to the ringing that signified Laura's death. At last they heard her voice. It sounded almost unfriendly. They asked where she'd been. In the next room. Both of them spoke into the receiver. They spoke of their anxiety, of their need to hear her voice once more, to be reassured. They repeated how much they loved her and how impatiently they were looking forward to her return. The next morning they were both late for work and thought all day of nothing but her. In the evening they called her again. The conversation again lasted an hour, and they again assured her how much they loved her and how eagerly they longed to see her again. A few days later, she rang the doorbell. Paul was at home alone. She was standing in the doorway, and she was wearing dark glasses. She fell into his arms. They went into the living room, sat down in armchairs facing each other, but she was so nervous that she got up after a little while and began pacing the room. She talked feverishly. Then he too rose from the chair, and he too paced the room and talked. Paul spoke with contempt about his former student, protege, and friend. That could, of course, be explained by a desire to make Laura's breakup easier. But he was himself surprised that he meant everything he said seriously and sincerely. Bernard is a spoiled child of rich parents, an arrogant, conceited person. Laura was leaning against the fireplace, gazing at Paul. And Paul noticed all of a sudden that she was no longer wearing dark glasses. She held them in her hand and gazed at him, her eyes swollen and moist. He realized that for quite a while she hadn't been listening to what he was saying. Oh, it's Mahler. Shit, I didn't know it was Mahler. It's perfect. He fell silent. The room became filled with a stillness which made him, through some sort of mysterious power, move closer to her. She said, Paul, why didn't we two meet sooner? Before all the others? Those words spread out between them like a mist. Paul stepped into that mist and reached out his hand like someone who can't see and gropes his way. His hand touched Laura. Laura sighed and let Paul's hands stay touching her skin. Then she stepped aside and put her glasses back on. That gesture made the mist lift, and they were once again facing each other as brother-in-law and sister-in-law. A while later, Agnes returned from work and walked into the room.